Welcome to the first week of our 5-week masterclass. This is just the beginning, being cultural responsive. This week, we're going to explore cultural responsiveness, the basics. We're going to answer the question, what is cultural responsiveness? Through learning the 4 elements of cultural responsiveness, defining cultural responsiveness, and connecting cultural responsiveness with building relationships in our classrooms. I want to begin with a couple of disclaimers. First, it's important to understand that being culturally responsive isn't a checklist or something that you can just learn and then implement. It's a process, and that process is ongoing. So, what we're going to do in this 5 weeks course is truly just the very first steps in becoming a culturally responsive educator. Second, I want you to recognize that this is not just one more thing. Being culturally responsive is the thing that will ensure that your students feel that they belong, that they matter, that you see them, and that you can truly connect with them across difference. So now that we have those 2 understandings, let's get started. This training came from several years of training for the Washington Education Association Culturally Responsive Classroom Management Training. I realized that in the first hour of our training, we were doing some really heavy work, and it really warranted a longer, deeper dive. So I've developed this 5-week course to really look at the first of the 4 elements of being culturally responsive. So let's get started. Over the last 20 years in my classroom, I've had the opportunity to work with a wide variety of students. I started in a designed instruction special education classroom. I was a Peace Corps volunteer teaching English as a foreign language. I taught in rural Texas as well as urban Texas. I taught in Bronx, New York, and in Japan, and I teach now in Spokane, Washington. My students currently are newcomers to our nation. They're brand new immigrant and refugee students. And over those last 20 years, I've learned so much about my students and their cultures. And that's actually where I want to begin. I want to begin with the idea of culture. What does culture even mean? Often, when we talk about culture, we're talking about the things that we can definitely determine about another individual, like the country in which they were born, or the language they speak, if they speak a language other than English, or the color of their skin. For example, the things that contribute to my culture, if you were just to look at me, would be my gender, possibly my age, and definitely the fact that I am a white woman. And yes, these are very clearly a part of a person's culture. But culture is also much deeper and more holistic than that. Culture is all of the elements of a person that make up who that person is. And so culture are the things not only that we can see and that we can definitely determine, it's also the things that we can't see. So for example, socioeconomic status, or the neighborhood in which a person grew up in, whether a person has a single parent household or a 2-parent household. Maybe the person is from the foster care system. The religion of a person, the political ideology, all of these things that we don't necessarily wear on the outside are also part of our culture. Now, in this discussion, I think it's also important to recognize that there are elements of our cultures that do impact us more than other elements. So, for example, this is something that's discussed widely and something that we are currently confronting a great deal. But a Black person will walk through the world in a very different way than a white person will. So that element of a person's culture definitely has a very, very strong impact on how they interact with the world. But I think it's important to note that culture is not only the things that we see, but also the things that we cannot see. Because oftentimes when we think about culture, we think about what is different from us. But there are so many things underneath that could also be a connection, a commonality between us. So I want us to just start there with a recognition that culture is everything, every element, every experience that makes up who a person is and how they interact with the world. And we'll be exploring this notion of culture a lot more in the second week. So I want to just back up a little bit and I want to talk about the four elements of cultural competence. And I'm hesitant to use the word cultural competence because I don't believe that a person can actually be competent in being culturally responsive, because that implies that cultural competence is something that we can just learn and then do. And as I stated previously, it's not that simple. Being culturally responsive is an ongoing process, full of self reflection, self doubt, failures, and successes, and it's something that we constantly have to do. But there are four elements that make up being culturally responsive. So the first is awareness. Awareness is in reference to of self. This is self-awareness. This is a recognition of our own values, our own biases, the assumptions that we make, and our preconceived notions about other people when we are interacting with them. And it also is an awareness of our own personal limitations, meaning our limited worldview, our limited experience, and how that impacts how we interact with another person. The second element is knowledge. Knowledge is this attempt to understand diverse cultures. And remember, when we talked about culture, we're talking about all the elements that make up culture. So, say I grew up in a middle class household, but I am interacting mostly with kids who have lived in poverty. That's going to impact our interactions together. So it's important that I have knowledge of that element of their culture. So this includes their values, their practices, their communication style, the norms of their culture, their experiences, and their perspectives. The fourth element is skills. So this is developing appropriate, relevant, sensitive skills and strategies for working with culturally diverse populations. And it's also practicing those strategies and skills on a regular basis to hone those skills and ensure that you're utilizing those skills appropriately and culturally responsively, especially when interacting with students. And I want you also to note that it's important, before you even have skills, to have your awareness and your knowledge. The fourth one is advocacy, and this is where we move beyond our own development and into advocating. Advocating, which means using our privilege to support, speak out for, and on behalf of students, families, colleagues, and community members. So this is where we take all of our learning, our awareness, our knowledge, our skills, and we put it into practice to encourage others to also become culturally responsive. Now, there are those four elements of cultural competence, but the one that we're going to focus on in this 5 weeks is awareness. Like I said before, this is a deep dive into this first element of becoming a culturally responsive educator. And it's also, in my opinion, the most difficult piece. This is where we're going to really work on looking at ourselves, looking at our values, where those values come from, our biases and where those biases come from, our assumptions, the experiences that have created those assumptions, and our preconceived notions that have been created by our experiences. And then also really look at our personal limitations. What stops us from really connecting with every single one of our students? And so it might seem like this should be really quick and easy to do, but it's actually quite difficult. It's like looking in a mirror. We don't always like to look at the mirror in a mirror because we might see our flaws. I know that this is the case for me. Whenever I go into the bathroom, I often forget to look in the mirror. Even if I purposely went in there to look in the mirror, I often forget because I don't want to see those little things. I don't want to see the little flaws that I see in myself every time I look in the mirror. And so now imagine that we're not just looking at the physical attributes of ourselves, but we are turning that mirror and looking at our insides. We're looking at how we are, who we are, why we are who we are, and how that impacts how we walk through this world. And as it might seem like an easy task, but it's actually quite difficult.